Welcome. I'm Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Eric Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenteric.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well.
The following program is hosted by the NVG Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Eric Fleming. I am your host, Eric Fleming. Happy New Year to everybody. I hope y'all didn't miss me too much taking that week off, but it felt good. It felt good to take a break. That literally, I think, was my first break since 2019. Yeah, because it's like, you know, even when I had episodes, I didn't have guests, I was still plugging along. But that was my first deliberate break because I've been going even when I was on vacation and still doing episodes and stuff. You remember I went to the convention in Chicago and I had an interview scheduled during that week, and the adventure I had to just get Wi-Fi to do that interview was amazing. Anyway, but we're back and we've got a jam-packed episode this go around to kick us off. We're going to be talking about systemic racism and going to have somebody running for Congress, and even we're going to talk about national parks. So I've got 3 very dynamic guests that are coming on, and I hope that you enjoy those interviews as we start this new year, and we're about to go into a new season. As you know, I tend to do about 2 seasons a year, and break it off into 25 episodes per season. And so, if you go to www.momenteric.com, you'll be able to see it. And then that way you can break it down where it's like, well, I want to check out all the guests that he had, on season 11. You can do that. Or season, hear what he was saying in season 3. You can do all that on the website. And also you can subscribe to the podcast. Yeah. New year, but same thing. We're trying to continue our goal to get as many subscribers as we can. It's important for little old independent podcasters like me to continue to offer a voice that's different than what you're hearing. And, there's some like-minded folks out there, and I listen to a lot of them myself. But the one thing that I think is kind of nuanced is the fact that I actually am African American, for one, and 2, that, I was an elected official. And in this political landscape, you don't really get a lot of people that actually has done the work. who's actually been out there and been an activist and all that kind of stuff, you know, taking the time to do a podcast and talk to other people. And so that's what I bring to the table, and I hope that you like it. And with your support, we're going to continue to do it. I know times are hard. Affordability is an issue. It is not a hoax. And so, if you can, cool. But the most important thing is I need y'all to listen. And the more listeners we have, that makes it better. And write reviews, the whole 9 yards. But just go to www.momenteric.com. If you just want to do the subscription part, you can go to patreon.com/amomentwitheric and show your support and love that way too. All right. So I'm glad that we're back, which also means that Grace G is back. So ladies and gentlemen, it's time to kick our program off. And as always, we kick it off with a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Eric. A federal agent killed 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good, a U.S. citizen, during an immigration enforcement operation in Minneapolis, Minnesota. U.S. forces captured federally indicted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife during a large-scale strike on Caracas. President Trump announced the removal of the National Guard from Chicago, Los Angeles, and Portland, though he warned they would return if crime increased. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz announced he will not seek a third term, choosing instead to focus on a welfare fraud crisis that has drawn significant criticism from the Trump administration. The House Ethics Committee is investigating Representative Mike Collins for allegedly misusing congressional resources. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has initiated steps to demote Senator Mark Kelly from his retired Navy rank as punishment for Kelly's public encouragement of troops to refuse illegal orders. Mayor Daniel Lurie signed a new ordinance setting up a framework for a reparations fund for Black residents in San Francisco, though the law does not currently allocate any city money for payouts. Democrat Renee Hardman became the first Black woman elected to the Iowa Senate after winning a special election. The Trump administration is facing backlash after EEOC Chair Andrea Lucas released a video suggesting that white men may be victims of workplace discrimination and should seek compensation under civil rights laws. Milwaukee County Judge Hannah Dugan resigned after being convicted of obstruction for helping a migrant evade an immigration arrest in her courtroom. A U.S. appeals court ruled that California's ban on openly carrying firearms is unconstitutional. South Carolina health officials reported that a measles outbreak in the state's northwest region has grown to 185 cases. And Republican Representative Doug LaMalfa of California died at the age of 65. I am Grace G., and this has been A Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. And it's good to hear your voice again, especially to kick off 2026. All right. Now it is time for my guest, Naomi Raquel Enright. Naomi Raquel Enright is a writer, educator, and consultant based in Brooklyn, New York. She is also a National SEED, which stands for Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity Facilitator, and a New York Appleseed board member. Raised in New York City, she was born in La Paz, Bolivia, to an Ecuadorian mother and a Jewish-American father, and is a native speaker of English and Spanish. She holds a BA in anthropology from Kenyon College and studied at the Universidad de Sevilla, Spain. She writes about racism and identity, loss, and parenting. Her essays have appeared in several publications, including Hold the Line magazine, Family Story, Roll Reboot, Streetlight magazine, among others, and in the anthologies The Beijing of America, Sharing Gratitude, and Streetlight magazine. She has been interviewed on a number of podcasts, including Global Citizenship and Equity, Inclusion School, War Stories from the Womb, The Mixed Creator, Project 25, and Dear White Women. Her essay, The Hidden Curriculum, received an honorable mention in Streetlight Magazine's 2021 Essay Memoir Contest. Her book, Strength of Soul, was published in April 2019. And a lot of the questions that I'm going to ask are going to come from that book, which is a very, very powerful and insightful book. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Naomi, Raquel, Enright. All right. Naomi, Raquel, Enright. How you doing? You doing good?
I'm good. Hi, Eric. Good to be here. Thank you.
Well, it's good to have you. Happy New Year to you. I guess I can say this on the air. You're the first person I've interviewed for 2026.
Awesome.
And so for the listeners, if I sound a little off or rusty, it's because it's the first time I've taken a break since 2019 for the podcast. So I'll try to get back into the groove. But Ms. Enright, I greatly appreciate you coming on to discuss, a book that you wrote about the time that I started doing my podcast.
That's right.
Strength of Soul. But I think it's very, very pertinent to what we're dealing with now. And so again, thank you for coming on. So I start the interview off with a couple of icebreakers. And so the first icebreaker is a quote.
Okay.
And the quote I want you to respond to is, our stories are not written on our faces. What does that quote mean to you?
That is a profound quote to me, because I think so often we make assumptions about who people are, where they stand on certain issues, how they might feel about certain issues based on the exterior and based on the superficial. And so I think if we really wish to understand ourselves as well as each other and certainly history, we have to go beyond that superficial surface level aspect. And so our stories are not written on our faces means there is so much more to us as human beings. And if we take the time to understand that, I think we are better equipped to understand each other, to foster empathy and compassion, and to create change.
Okay. So now the next icebreaker is what we call 20 questions.
Okay.
So I need you to give me a number between 1 and 20.
I'll go with 10.
All right. What one fact do you wish people who voted differently than you in the last election knew? And that can be about how you vote, about the current state of the world, about anything.
One fact I would wish for those who voted differently from myself in the last election knew was that a vote is not a single issue. And so when you cast a vote, you are voting on a number of issues. And although not all of the issues may impact you personally or even your loved ones personally, they will impact someone. And to have a broader understanding of that would be, I think, a much more informed way of voting and taking into consideration what your vote, the impact it has.
Okay. Why did you decide to write this book, The Strength of Soul?
All right. Yeah. So Strength of Soul was published in 2019, right? The year you started this podcast. So it's going to be 7 years in April. And I made the decision to write Strength of Soul in part for my son, but it was much bigger than my own family and my own child. Strength of Soul is an examination, a very personal examination of systemic racism, language, identity, history, and even what I mentioned before about the quote, the assumptions that we make. And so Strength of Soul to me is a deep exploration of how we could challenge anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and systemic racism differently and in ways that relate more to us as a collective and sort of, right, this oneness of humanity without losing sight of the very systemic the real systemic issues and differences in how our experiences are vastly different depending on who we are and the assumptions, in fact, that are made about us. But I chose to write it because it felt to me that there was no book or even sort of thinking around a person like my son and a family like mine. My family is multi-ethnic. We are bilingual. We are international. And my son is presumed to be white. And I'm brown-skinned. My son is not. And for me, it felt that there was no space for a person specifically like him, but by extension, a family like my own, where we're sort of holding space in we're holding different spaces, I should say. We have our feet in different worlds. And I felt compelled to create a narrative that folks could refer to as a different option, another option for challenging systemic racism.
Why is the link between language, culture, and identity inextricable?
Mm-hmm. So I even had this thinking when I was a Spanish teacher. I was a Spanish teacher for 8 years. And I began to realize, even in my teaching of Spanish, that the language we use entirely informs the way that we think. And it informs the way that we interact even. And I had an understanding of this to some degree because I am a native English and Spanish speaker. And so I've always held these two languages in my brain. And my students would even point out to me that I was different in Spanish. I had a different energy, a different rhythm. And I began to think, wait, there's something to this. And when I left the Spanish classroom not long after my son was born and decided to pursue anti-racist, equity work more, as more of my focus instead of the Spanish language classroom, I began to hear language that solidified this notion of an inherent difference between white people and everyone else, essentially. And for me, with the child that I have, it was jarring, it was disconcerting, and it's disorienting because I'm the mother of this human being and I'm trying to raise him to understand history and to understand inequity and to understand himself and to not have others tell him who he is or what his role is or how he should think or how he should feel, including myself, right? Even as the parent, giving him, right, the space to explore and discover for himself. But it dawned on me that our language has to change in terms of how we challenge white supremacy and anti-Blackness and systemic racism, because so often we are solidifying the ethos, right? The ideology of these systems, which is not only an inherent difference between white people and everyone else, but this automatic presumption of power and protection and privilege for white folks or those who are presumed to be white, and disenfranchisement, criminalization, marginalization for Black and brown people. And so to me, these three elements, language, culture, and identity, are absolutely intertwined, and we cannot separate them from each other in thinking not only about how to challenge systemic inequity, but in thinking about who we are and understanding ourselves and each other.
So you close chapter 9 with this phrase: the language and ideology of racial difference and whiteness are undoubtedly the master's tools. Expound on that, because I think in the last answer, you were kind of setting the framework for us. So kind of get into that a little bit.
Yes. So the master's tools, right, is borrowing from Audre Lorde, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And to me, the language of racial difference and whiteness are indeed the master's tools because those were the tools created to justify inequity and injustice and oppression. And we cannot envision a different future if we're consistently using the methodology and the tools that were created to justify dehumanization ultimately. And so for me, those are the master's tools. And, I've now been working on this for a long time, right? 7 years since the book came out, 15 years since my son was born. So I've done a lot of thinking about this, and I am continuously honing what that could look like and what that can sound like. And one thing I've come across that I have found extremely helpful to my own work and to my own understanding, and I would hope, right, to creating change, is Isabel Wilkerson's caste and casteism and her language of caste, and how caste really places the onus on the system as it functions as opposed to who we are as individuals. And so when I read her book in 2020, I was blown away by how masterfully she was able to explain the system that we have in place and have had for centuries. And it explained not only that, but it also highlighted the reality I experienced as the mother of this presumed to be white son. And so her book and her work, for me, are further sort of progress in terms of being able to talk about these issues and create change differently.
So what about those of us, including me, that take pride in being Black or Blackness? Is our pride delaying systematic change?
Not at all. I think I make a real fine distinction between assuming inherent difference between white people and everyone else and feeling pride in who you are in your family history. And I also am very clear to distinguish between or separate anti-Blackness as its own beast, right? I think for a long time in my work and in my understanding of racism, I had it sort of all blended together. And it took my becoming a mother, actually, and becoming an adult, I suppose, to really see that anti-Blackness is its own separate entity, and it needs to be tackled much more directly and not necessarily in conjunction with, right? Because there are folks who are brown or who are new to this country who don't understand that systemic racism and white supremacy impact them as well, precisely because they are also feeding into anti-Blackness. And so for me to be a proud Black person or to feel ownership of being a Blackness is a cultural marker, right? That is a cultural, historical marker, even a social marker. But that should not be in conjunction with accepting that it is natural for white people or presumed to be white people to be safer and more privileged and more protected and even more empowered in the world than Black people, and then by extension, than brown people. And I actually appreciate the question because I think there's often a misunderstanding on my position and what I think and why. And I want to make it clear that I am also very much speaking to the experience of a person who is multi-ethnic, who exists between cultures and worlds, who speaks two languages. You know, I'm native speaker of both. And so that's a very different experience. And I think it is in sort of owning and recognizing the validity of those experiences that more understanding and change can occur as well, right? So I hope that helps to answer the question and helps to also highlight that I do not have it all as one, because it isn't, right? Anti-Blackness is very much, it's very separate as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Why is it important for us to focus on the scholarship of the shelves as well as the scholarship of the selves?
Yes. So that is coming from the National Seed organization that I trained with in July 2023, maybe? No, it's even earlier. 2015. What am I saying? 2015. Now, right? The new year always throws off one's timing. So I learned that in that training, and SEED stands for Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity. And it was a transformative, profound, life-altering experience for me, that training in 2015, right? 4 years later, the book was published. And I was very taken by this sort of, mantra, the scholarship of the shelves and the scholarship of the selves. And I think it is crucial because we have to have a intellectual, scholastic understanding of history and of, right, sociology, all of these subjects, right? But we also need to know where we stand within that and our own personal histories, right? And so I think so often in this country, we talk about history as separate from the lived experience and what people are carrying with them, right? And that they might pass on, right, to their children or to future generations, be they parents or not. And so to me, you cannot have one with the other. You can't have an understanding intellectually of something without also an emotional, visceral understanding as well. And that was part of the training, was really examining where we stand within these systemic social structures based on our experience, right? If you're a gay man, or if you're a trans woman, or if you're an immigrant, or if you're differently abled, right? Whatever your identity markers are impact the social reality as well. And so they are also inextricably linked, to return to that earlier question about language, culture, and identity.
Okay. How has the language of racial difference tried to erase your lived experience?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say I felt some erasure in that language even growing up, because I would often feel protective of my father. My father was a white Jewish American educator, civil rights activist, and really a gem of a human being. And so often in spaces, blank statements would be made that would make me feel protective of him. I would make me feel even defensive, because I would think, you don't know my father, right? You don't know what he's been through or who he is or the values he's passing on to me and my older brother. And so there was some discomfort growing up. However, I would say it didn't become really almost untenable until motherhood. And so when my son was born and I began to really notice this acceptance that there are white people and everyone else, and it was just disorienting to me, because I thought, well, there's my son and I brought him into the world, right? My husband and I brought him into the world, and he's also has this whole history through me as well, right? Ecuadorian, Spanish speaking. He's bilingual as well, actually. And so it felt to me like a person like him and a family like mine just didn't factor in, that we're just almost figments of people's imagination, right? And I know we're not figments of people's imagination because we're here, right? And so to me, I really wanted to sort of add to the canon. I don't mean to imply that my work is, as necessarily, influential or profound as others, but I did want to contribute, right, to the canon of work, examining and challenging white supremacy, systemic racism, and anti-Blackness, specifically through the lens of a person like myself, right? And so I continue to feel that disorientation, but it bothers me much less because of the work that I do and because of how my husband and I and our families have been raising my son, and even because of who he is. I mean, he sort of, for me, is the embodiment of all of my efforts, and he has a real profound understanding and has since he was quite young about history and himself and others. And so for me, that feels empowering and is a better use of my energy than being concerned with not feeling included.
All right. So what was your reaction when Vice President Vance proclaimed that white people don't have to apologize for being white anymore?
Well, it certainly upset me on a visceral level, because it's a complete denial of systemic reality and of history. And it's feeding into the idea that racism or discrimination or inequity are personal slights. They are much more than personal slights, right? This is about education, about our criminal justice system, about immigration. And so for me, it felt like a cop-out. It's lazy. It's insensitive. It's ahistorical. And it's wrong. Right? I think that I don't believe white people have to apologize for being white, but I do think white people have to acknowledge the privilege and power and protection that they are ensured because of white supremacy and because of anti-Blackness and because of systemic racism, or, to borrow from Isabel Wilkerson, because of casteism, right? I think that is a crucial aspect of understanding history and of creating change. And I think it's been distorted. And yeah, distorted is a good word for it. You're this idea that it's a personal thing, right? And so for me, it's very concerning, that aspect, because I think, you're entitled to feel offended personally anytime, right? That's just a natural human response to something, right? But to conflate that with historical and systemic truths is extremely dangerous. And I think that's precisely why we are where we are, at least, one of the reasons. And so, yes, it bothered me a great deal. And particularly so as the parent of, a person who out in the world, people are seeing a white person, right? They're not assuming anything beyond that about my son out in the world. And so for me, it felt so dangerous for a person, right? It's the kind of thing that you feed into these notions that actually allow for people to remain ignorant of history and of how this inequitable system actually impacts them as well, or potentially impacts them as well, differently, but certainly impacts them. So it's a dangerous statement, and not only dangerous but also untrue, and like I said, like ahistorical.
Yeah, because when he said that, it took me back to when I was living in Jackson, Mississippi at the time, and they used to try to do these racial reconciliation things. And I remember I stood up and said, this is going to be a hard exercise, because usually people reconcile after there's been an apology. And I don't ever remember the apology part. So when I heard him say, well, we need to stop apologizing, I said, when did you start? Right?
Exactly right. Exactly right.
I missed that somewhere in my 60 years. So yeah, I understand, but I appreciate the way that you addressed it. Which leads me to this question. Why do you think it is a hard concept for Americans to understand that race is a product of racism?
Oh, wow. Ooh. I think that is a very difficult concept for most Americans to grasp, precisely because of the sort of acquiescence and acceptance of race as immutable and true. And so it's very hard to explain that the system and its inequities are absolutely real and true and have been, but that the origin of them, the justification for them, is a lie, right? This idea that we are inherently different from each other based on skin color. And so I think that conflation was purposeful. I think it's by design. And I think it has been an experiment that has continued to work for centuries, and that even in my own work, in anti-racist work, I have come across this utter confusion in terms of what it is that we're actually naming and what it is that we actually wish to change. And so for me, I'm very, very intentional and clear about consistently putting the onus on the system and on history, and not who people are intrinsically. And certainly not on this lie that because I'm brown-skinned, I'm automatically different from you as a Black person, or automatically different from someone as a white person. For me, that is something I continue, like I said before, to hone and to strengthen. But I would say that given the number of years I've been thinking about it and writing about it and working on it, I'm very clear that if you want to create change and you want to change a system, challenge and change a system, you have to name that system. And you have to not be continuously naming lies that were created for a purpose, and that purpose is being served and continues to be served. And there are many writers who have examined this, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates has examined it. James Baldwin examined it. Isabel Wilkerson, Toni Morrison. There's so many who have named this in various ways over the course of history and time. And yet we continue to revert to this way of thinking and way of engaging, which I also feel it's been weaponized as well, right? Because people have chosen to use the fact that we are actually not inherently different from each other as a way to deny systemic inequity, racist inequity. And so that's been also by design. And that is something that I'm also finding in my work that I'm up against, right? It's up against the lie itself, and then it's up against the weaponization of the truth as a denial of the reality. And so for me, it's so complex and sensitive and deep-seated, but I am determined in my own corner of the world to create change in this way of really challenging systemic racism at its root and not perpetuating its ideology, its ethos, and certainly not its language. And hopefully I'm making an impact in some capacity.
Yeah, and I got a question as far as your impact goes.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to go back. What can be done public policy wise to stop racism from being this sixth sense that we have?
Oh, so that's a tough one for me because I feel it's a little bit outside of my expertise and my own realm, right? I'm an educator. Education is really my focus. But with that said, I do think one way is that so often when we use the word race, we could replace it with racism. Often, I think, more often than not, we could, or even specifically systemic racism. And so I think that's one very intentional and I think effective way of discussing what we need to discuss and creating the change that we need to create. I have sat with many an article or, even a post, right, where I read it and I think, how could this be reframed so that we're actually naming the system? And I have an essay that was published back in 2021 called The Hidden Curriculum, which did just that. I actually came across kind of an ad for how kids, quote unquote, conceptualize race between birth or age zero, it said, to 6+ years. And I was really struck by the ad because it was really solidifying racism is what it was doing. It was solidifying this notion of inherent difference. And of course, it erased my family and my own child. And so I sat with it for weeks and thought, how can I frame this differently so that it's actually saying what it wishes to say, which is how do you teach children about racism? How do you teach children to understand that systemic racism is real, that inequity is real, that our history, has so much evidence of this. How do you do that? And I sat with this thing and I rewrote it actually. And then I wrote an entire essay based on that rewriting. And it takes time and energy. Like I said, it took me weeks to do just that little ad, to just think, how can I frame this differently? It took me a long time, but it was worth the time because when people have read that essay, they have said to me, wow, what you're rewriting completely alters what is actually being said and what you wish to convey to educators, to caregivers, to parents, and, to answer your question away, to bigger parties, right? And public policy and whatnot, right? That if you are reframing, you actually might get closer to, you will get closer to the truth of what it is you want to say.
Yeah. With the onset of President Trump in the American political landscape, how much of a setback have we faced as a nation in dealing with the eradication of racism?
Oof. I sadly believe that we have, it's quite a setback, right? It's a huge setback. And it's one that is very concerning and infuriating and frightening for those of us invested in this work and for those of us who really wish for this country to be what it's always claimed it is. And so I'm very concerned. And I think at the same time, however, I think it's an absolute response, right, to changes that have been made or, we're on the horizon. And it simply requires more effort and more energy and more focus. And I think part of that focus is what we've been discussing, which is precisely naming the system and placing the onus on the system and understanding history. So I feel that, yes, it is a setback, quite a big one, I think, but I don't think it means we can't. I don't think that at all. For me, to think that would be defeatist, and it would be, I think, also an erasure of all the work that has been done and how many folks in the country actually do wish for positive social change, because there are quite a few of us, and even folks who thought they wanted this, realize now they don't, right? And so I think that can serve as, fuel for the work itself and for hopefully this country one day, right? Perhaps it'll be in my lifetime, perhaps not, but one day really living up to the ideals that has claimed from the start, right? E pluribus unum, right? Out of many, one. And so I have to think it's possible. And that's the space that I try to work from and remain in.
Okay. So I've got 3 more questions. So I wanted to go back to, you were talking about your work. How has being an other given you an advantage in your work?
So as an other, which I'm not entirely comfortable with that description because to me it sort of implies that there is a standard and a norm. And so I'm not wholly comfortable with that description. However, I haven't had that experience, right? My whole life, I've always been on the outs. And I would say that reality of constantly looking in or not feeling represented or reflected has been ultimately a gift in my life because it has allowed me to see people and situations and understand people and situations more broadly, more holistically, more openly. And it's allowed for me to connect with a wide range of folks who wouldn't necessarily connect with each other, but will connect with me. And I think that's kind of beautiful to be able to connect with people for a wide range of reasons, because of my experience on the outside or in the space between, I like to say, right, that I exist in the space between. And so it's absolutely informed my work, my lived experience, my relationships. I mean, my husband is a white man from the Midwest. He grew up in Ohio. His family's from Indiana originally. He is not bilingual. He understands, I'd say, 95 to 98% of what we say in Spanish, but he does not speak it. And he has traveled now internationally more so as an adult. But when I met him, he'd left the country once and then had left it again with me in 2018 to meet my family in Guayaquil, in Ecuador. And yet, because of my experience of not necessarily, or rather knowing that I won't necessarily know who a person is unless I give them the space to tell me and share, he's one of the most open-minded, curious, compassionate, empathetic, caring individuals who is aware of the inequity that exists in this country. He's disgusted by it, all the while understanding that he has benefited from it, right? As a white male in this country. He has been completely on board in raising our son to understand the nuance and complexity of his multi-ethnic identity, right? Despite his presumption of whiteness. And so for me, all that is to say that I could have written my husband off if it hadn't been for my understanding that our stories are not written on our faces, to return to the quote. So I would say all that is the outcome of existing in the space between.
Yeah. And I should have put the quotes on other but it shows how you've evolved even from writing the book, because that was a term that you had used to kind of describe yourself. And it's like, I don't describe myself as that anymore. So that's cool. That shows that growth. All right.
Thank you.
Is the soul of America strong enough for radical change and reconstruction?
The soul of America is strong enough for radical change and reconstruction. Wow. That's profound. I think the soul of America will only be strong enough for that until it reckons with its past and with the wrongs it has committed, with the notion of exceptionalism, right? I think if all of those things were faced, I believe the soul of America would be able to withstand, right? And become what it could be. But at this point in time, I don't think so. Sadly, I don't, because of what I said, right? That we have really decided to not face our history head on, rewriting, sanitizing. And all of that has led to the moment we find ourselves in now in the 5th anniversary of the insurrection on the Capitol in 2021. And so I hope that someday that could be the case. But given what's going on now and what has gone on, I don't think so. No.
I got you. I can just imagine you talking to a student and it's like, yeah, I think you can do well in this major, but you're not really applying yourself. That's where I kind of got that vibe. All right.
Good teacher.
That's right. All right. So let's close this out. This is something I'm trying to do with all my guests for this particular year. I want you to finish this sentence. I have hope because.
I have hope because I am capable of being and creating the change I wish to see. I have hope because of the family I come from and the ancestors who brought me here. I have hope because of my son and the compassionate, aware, kind, intelligent, and determined individual that he is. And I have hope because if I give that up, I have nothing.
Yeah. Well, Naomi, Raquel, Enright, this was worth the wait. I greatly appreciate you coming on. I greatly appreciate the gift of the book. Very, very, like I said, even though it's been written almost 7 years ago now, it's still very timely and very powerful and very personal. It's almost more like a memoir than a thought-provoking book, but yet it still accomplishes both things. So if people want to reach out to you and get you to help them understand some things, how can they do that?
Absolutely. I would love for folks to reach out. I'm quite active on LinkedIn, but beyond that, my website is www.naomiraquel.com, and people can reach out to me through my website as well as read my work, hear other podcast interviews, and I hope people will. I'm always willing and wanting for this kind of interaction and collective effort.
Well, again, thank you for doing this and much continued success, not only this year, but throughout your career and trying to get us on the right path. And hopefully we can get that strength to do the right thing eventually. So again, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
All right, guys. And we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now it is time for my next guest, Dr. Eboni Preston Goddard. Led by a call to action, Eboni is a management professional with a background in nonprofit administration, program operations, partnerships, community engagement, and workforce development. She has spent the last decade working with public land management agencies on youth programs, DEI programming and facilitation, advocacy, community engagement, recruitment, inclusive hiring practices, and volunteer engagement. Outside of work, Eboni serves as a board member for Justice Outside, Georgia Conservation Voters, the Next 100 Coalition, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, and the Association for Outdoor Recreation and Education. She holds a BA from Duke University, MSW from Columbia University, and MBA and MPA from Kennesaw State University, a certificate of business analytics from the Wharton School, and a PhD in public policy from Southern University and A&M College. In her free time, Eboni is an avid hiker, reader, and CrossFit enthusiast. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Dr. Eboni Preston Goddard. All right. Dr. Eboni Preston Goddard. How you doing, sister? You doing good?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing fine, man. I'm honored to have you to come on. So I wanted to talk to you about the work that you do dealing with the national parks, specifically with the National Parks Conservation Association, and how closely you relate to the workers and the actual parks themselves. And so I'm kind of in a way, because as we're recording this is after the young lady had been shot in Minneapolis, and which is kind of related to what you do, because when I was like about a month old, maybe a little more than a month, there was a lady named Viola Liuzzo, who died in Alabama, and during the Summer Montgomery March, and the Park Service has a memorial for her on the trail, because that's part of the Park Service, and we'll get into some of the historic stuff, but that's kind of where my mind is, but I'm gonna push through it if you forgive me on that. But
Absolutely.
So normally how I start these interviews is that I do a couple of icebreakers. So the first icebreaker is a quote that I want you to respond to. And the quote is, "Let your voice be known." What does that quote mean to you?
You know, the first thing that popped in my mind in response to that was another quote. And it's Booker T. Washington. And he said, excellence is to do a common thing in an uncommon way. Right. And so just using the powers and the strengths that we have to share with the world, it comes with a lot of responsibility. Right. And so just being able to live in truth with that and make sure that, because unfortunately these things continue to happen, right? You just named 2 women in less than 30 seconds, right? That have been impacted by things that we've seen our community being impacted by over generations. And so using that to not lose sight of it, but also find a way to inspire and push forward and keep fighting, because we have to, right?
All right. So now the next one is called 20 questions.
Okay.
So I need you to give me a number between 1 and 20.
8.
Okay. What is one thing that you hope the current administration will or will not do during the remainder of their term?
Do you want me to put my work hat on, or is this just Ebony?
It's just Ebony. It's just Ebony talking. Yeah.
No more cuts. These cuts have been devastating. You know, when we talk about the cuts in jobs, when we talk about the cuts in funding, when we talk about the cuts in just positions and agency, the impact will be felt for generations. I say, you know, as we continue on like a continuing resolution and working through past budgets, I said, we'll never go back. You know, when COVID happened, we say we'll never go back to 2019, right? And like, we'll never go back to the time of the last administration, put politics aside, but to say that even if Trump said, I'm going to reverse everything that I did in 2025, it's still going to take generations to recover. So to kind of stop the bleeding, if you will, for a little while, just stopping the cuts. And I'll leave it there, but certainly there's more we can add to that if there's interest.
Yeah. You know, we gonna keep this a safe space for you on that regard. Did you know Betty Reed Soskin? Did you ever meet her?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's a good one.
Yeah. So was she the oldest park ranger when she retired? Okay.
Was.
Yeah. So lift her up, because she just passed, I guess, earlier this month or last month?
Right. Late last month, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So what is the National Parks Conservation Association?
Sure. So we're an advocacy group on behalf of the National Park Service. What does that mean for people that don't know about the National Park Service or what advocacy means, especially as it relates to a nonprofit? We were started by the same people that started the National Park Service, right? 1916. We were started 3 years later. And so we're a nonprofit side of it. So as a federal agency, there's certain things they can do and say, and then there's certain things they can't do and things that they can't say. And so we do it on behalf, right? And so if we feel like they're not getting the fair shot, whether it be for funding, whether it be an interpretation, whether it be environmental threats, and they can't speak out on those, whether it be positions, whether there should be more investment in cultural resources, whether there should be more investment in the protection of landscapes, things like that. We do it on their behalf. So we are the only agency that sits as the advocacy organization for the National Park Service.
Now, are you the first African American to serve in that position that you're in?
I'm not the first, but we can count on one hand how many there's been in 100+ years.
I understand.
Yeah.
You know, I was the first Black sergeant at arms for the Mississippi State Senate since Reconstruction. And that was,
there you go.
So, I mean, it's like, you know, I tried to follow the previous Black guy that was Blanche K. Bruce and get into U.S. Senate, but that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I definitely understand about the rarity and stuff. Fortunately, I kind of set a domino effect because the next 2 or 3 sergeant arms were African Americans. So
that's awesome. Yeah. I'll say all of my predecessors, there were 2 were in the last 5 years, and then I'm serving with another one right now. So we're it, but
okay,
we're doing the work.
Yeah. How did Dr. Eboni Preston Goddard become a champion for our national parks?
You know, it just kind of, if I'm being honest, fell into my lap. I was one of those students that was just very curious with all the things. I went to a university where I lived in a bubble, and I kind of lost myself for a little bit, if I'm being honest. But my senior year, I was able to go on a week tour around the state of North Carolina with the NAACP. Their state conference office was right down the street from us. And it was the reality check that I say I needed. Not to get religious, but it was God's timing. I really needed to go on that trip at that time and with those folks and meet with different community members to have a reminder like, hey, this is right down the road and people are living grossly different lives than you. And all of these things could change in a moment. Again, we saw that with COVID. But I did that. And so instead of saying my plan for the 4 years had been to go to med school, and I called my mom and I was like, I don't know if right now is the time for med school. And so she's like, well, don't go, which I appreciate her for saying that at the time, as it really kind of just opened my world up. And so I took some time off and I went to teach in Louisiana there. I met some social workers that were really doing a lot of good work, and I was inspired by that work, which I then pivoted from going to med school to School of Social Work, where I did that work in New York City. That was really important in that it introduced me eventually where I did my internship, my second year of graduate school up there at the National Urban League. And so to do this work intimately in North Carolina with the NAACP, then go to the National Urban League where I focus, yes, on social work, but specifically workforce development. And I was just really seeing how my first year when I was doing therapy and working with communities, everybody came in, I'm hungry. I got bills to pay. I have responsibility, right? And it just really showed me as this budding professional, if you will, the importance of the workforce. And so to work in that workforce development department nationally, but based in New York, was National Urban League really opened my eyes. And so after being in New York for a few years, I needed to go back down south. I just missed it, my family, everything. I'm a Southerner at heart. And so I came back down south and I was like, I really want to stick with this workforce development stuff. So I just started looking for jobs and I found one that happened to be in conservation. Didn't know what the National Park Service was, let alone other agencies like the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management. The list goes on, but I very quickly became very intimately working with them as partners and just trying to get young people, young Black folks, jobs in these spaces as I quickly saw that, hey, there's a lot of good opportunities here that we simply don't even know about, right? Opportunities to be leaders in spaces, opportunities to really make an impact on policy and interpretation and the representation of what our people come to know and what history books look like, all of that. And I was like, this is all right here in these couple of agencies. Like, it's really powerful. And so I didn't know anything about it other than I just wanted to help people get jobs because I was inspired by that work with the National Urban League, but I had certainly found my footing. And so it's been over 10 years and I've continued to be in the space and kind of my opportunities have grown as I've been able to join different boards and things like that. But then a few years back, I was able to join National Parks Conservation Association. And so for me, This was me doing the walk that I had been telling our young people to do in those internships. In that before, I was just advocating for them to be in space, right? You can do this job. Look at this. How do we advance your career? But it's like, okay, well, I have this policy background. I kept going to school, right? I have this policy background. I have these connections. I have an understanding. This is my responsibility to use it. And so MPCA was the opportunity for me to do that. And so I do it thinking about parks. Not everybody still knows about parks. Nobody in my family can tell you what I do. Maybe my husband, but that's the extent of it, right? And they're just like, what do you mean you're going to a park? Are you okay? My grandmother's 92. The first time I told her I was going to the park, probably the last time I told her I was going to a park, she's fearful, right? Because she was, in high school, 5 of her best friends were lynched. And so they just hear woods and trees and things like that. So carrying all of that on my back and say, what do I do? And so while I do advocate for these parks, I'm intentional about advocating for cultural resources. I said before I was planning to go to med school. So I have a deep passion for science, natural resources, things like that. But I knew that me looking the way I do, coming with the background that I come with, that for me to step into this role, that I had a certain task at hand, and I was really on the cultural side. And so that's how I've been able to kind of drive this work for the last few years that I've been at the organization, and hopefully continue to find ways to embed these values in the work that we do every day.
So how many states do you cover in your work?
8 states.
Okay. All right. President Theodore Roosevelt viewed the parks as irreplaceable heirlooms, a sacred heritage to be protected, not exploited for short-term gain. Why do you agree with him?
These places are special. When it comes to the resources that are there, when it comes to the stories, the people that protected the land, the people that cultivated the land, the people that still live on the land, the stories that are there, the connections that are there, I think it's really important. And so these parks are supposed to be places, moments in time where we say, this has impacted the United States. This has impacted the people. And because of that, these are places that everybody should know, right? Now there's 433 parks across the system across my 8 regions. I have a little over 60, but I also have some national heritage areas as well. And so for me, it's like, hey, we need to know the stories of these places as they really do impact us. And so I agree with him in that. Unfortunately, we don't see the same love and treatment towards all of those places and stories. And then there's even more stories that need to be better told or more accurately told. And that's the work that I'm doing. But yes, we have this groundwork, this framework, if you will, to say that these places matter and it's important for every one of us to know about them and protect them.
Yeah. How much, you kind of touched on a little bit with your 20 questions answer, but how much damage was done by those toward the national parks?
It was catastrophic. We've seen cuts in positions. I'll say this first. In 2024, we had the highest visitation we've ever seen to national parks, right? Visitation at all-time high, record-breaking numbers at just about every park. So people are getting outside. People are coming internationally. People are going to their parks. They love their parks. We've seen it. It's quite literally in the data. And so starting in January, but the biggest cut was seen in February. We saw thousands of people losing positions in the agency. And it didn't stop. So that we saw cuts in funding. Parks were just like, oh, I had this plan, couldn't do it. You mentioned Selma to Montgomery. There was a big anniversary last year that we planned to celebrate. We've been working on it for months. Then last minute, parks like, we can't do it. We can't do the security. It's worth the risk. We had people that were young folks when they first did the march, and now they're about to do it again, and they're bringing their grandchildren. And so to say, hey, we can't do this anymore, it hurt, but we couldn't because the funding just wasn't there, right? So we've seen it in that way. We've seen just with different executive orders and secretarial orders, what can be interpreted at a park, what's there available in the bookstore, what's available for resources for people to have, and just kind of engaging in that conversation, especially in places like my Civil War parks or civil rights parks or Reconstruction era, like different, these things that they don't always paint us in the best light, but it's important for us to know that folks have been silenced. And so that's a big piece of what we're doing right now, combating erasure that's happened through those executive and secretarial orders. But the biggest thing I would say is funding as it relates again to the staffing itself and then programs, because they've just ceased.
Yeah. Why do you think you kind of touched on a little bit. Why do you think the parks have become more popular? Because it was like, I know that, people used to always talk about, going to like some of the big ones like Grand Canyon or Yosemite or, something like
Mm-hmm.
that. But, a lot of times people don't realize that some of the historical sites that are in respective states fall under the National Park Service.
Yeah.
But it seemed as though that, like you said, and I guess maybe it was kind of a backlash or, for lack of a better word, from COVID. And people were like, okay, well, we're going to rediscover these things. What did the data tell you about that? Does that correlate with what I'm saying, or was there some other factors?
I think it depends on the data that you're looking at, but I agree. I would say kind of looking big picture, yes, a lot of COVID, people are like, this is the way to get outside. I won't say most parks. A lot of parks don't charge fees to get in, so it's relatively inexpensive. And in that way, it can be accessible, even though some parks are really far and it can be difficult to get in, or they do have fees and things like that. So there's a balance there. But I think when I think about Black and brown communities, we're just talking about it more, right? It's just like, hey, did you know that this was here? Or I even speak for myself. I'm in Atlanta. I can't tell you how many family reunions I had at Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park. I had no idea that it was a part of the national park system, right? But to your point. And so there's a bit more of intentionality that's there. And you're seeing parks come up not to like name drop, but like Joy Reid and Roland Powell, they're all talking about parks now. I'm just like, well, what is this? Let me look at it. Oh, there's one in my backyard. Oh, there's one in my backyard and it's about somebody that looks like me. What's the story there? Let me go find out, right? And we've also had the creation of a lot of new parks over, let's say, the last 10, 15 years that are more representative of us and our story. So I think people are just finding connections that weren't physically there before, that they didn't know or maybe didn't have the arrowhead, if folks recognize that. But there's been more things pulling them in to say, hey, this space is for you, even if you're coming from far or you're coming from right down the road.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Martin Luther King Jr. historical site. What is the significance of designating that? Because at one point it was just a historical site, and then
right
before Congressman Lewis passed away, he was able to get the legislation passed to elevate it to a national park. So what's the significance in that?
Sure. So it was with that first designation, it was a part of the National Park Service, yes, but it was limited. So the redesignation allowed for more sites to be a part of it, right? So right now, as it stands, we have the firehouse, we have historic Ebenezer, we have where Martin Luther King Jr. was born and where he was raised in that house. Over the last couple of years, the National Park Service acquired, with the help of Robert Smith, tech billionaire, the family home. So where Martin and Coretta raised their children. And so you're able to tell a fuller story, right? The staff that's there, the superintendent, they have a new superintendent, Reggie Chappell, Judy Forte, she just retired a few years back. Black woman, Black man, but they're saying, hey, community, we need to really lift this up. And so it's on historic Auburn Avenue. And so really showing the power that was in Auburn Avenue. There's a lot of folks that were business owners and folks that thrived in the area, Black people, right? And to show how they cared and poured into community. And so that redesignation allowed for just a fuller, more powerful story to show the impact. To the left of historic Ebenezer is also the King Center, which Bernice King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter, she runs, and it's a really good way to complement that story too. So also to show the beauty of partnership, right? It just happens to be King's daughter, which I think is beautiful. We see the same thing with the Medgar Evers Institute in Jackson, Mississippi, where Rena Evers is leading that effort. But it just speaks to the power and the fullness of the story. And we've been able to make so much progress in the telling of that work because of those partnerships and because of those people. So it's exciting to see that redesignation, but also that continued passion just to share the story of the King family, but also the community community as a whole and the family there.
Yeah. It's really amazing. I tell people the story. I don't know if it's true, so you can tell me if I was, exaggerating a little bit, but I always say that the new Ebenezer church is the only church that the U.S. government has ever built. Now, I don't know if that's a true statement, but I say that to people that's like, oh, wow, just to kind of mess with folks.
I don't know, but I'll give you an Ebenezer fact that you can add to that. I'm not sure about that one, but I can certainly look into it and confirm it for you. But since its founding in the late 1800s, Ebenezer's only had 5 pastors. So starting, many years ago it wasn't a part of the King family, but then grandfather King, his last name was Williams, and then Daddy King, or we affectionately call him Daddy King, right? But MLK Sr., and then, you have Raphael Warnock now. Like, that's pretty powerful to see that over. This church has meant so much to so many people and so many community members far and close. And for it to only have 5 pastors in that time is pretty impactful.
So it's really cool to go to the Ebenezer where Dr. King Jr. and the daddy, I guess, was the senior pastor still there. But to go in and then to sit there and then listen to his voice in the chamber, that's a very, very powerful experience. And I encourage everybody to do that because it kind of sits you in. So and it doesn't play like the I Have a Dream speech or anything. It plays like sermons that he actually gave at the church. So you get that ambiance of actually being at the Ebenezer Baptist Church during the time he was preaching there. So I think that's an incredible thing. And I'm glad that the elevation allows you to get more. So when you say the family house, so is that the one on English Avenue or in that English Avenue district or?
Right. That's the one it's in Vining or in Vine City, right? So that's where he was with Coretta. So that one's not online yet. They're still figuring that piece out. Like, there was a public comment period, like, this is 3 miles away from where everything else is. Families still live here. What is parking going to look like? What does transportation look like? A lot of people that go to Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park are older folks, right? So, like, how do we care for our elders in this space? How do we make sure that we're not disrupting community? So they're still figuring all that stuff out. But the most popular one right now, if you will, was where King was raised. And if you go right now it's closed, but it'll open back up fairly soon. They'll be like, if you do the tour of the home, they'll be like, yeah, when he was a baby, he slept in that drawer right there, right? And so they've done a really good job of keeping things as they were. And again, that helps to have the insight of the family there. And Coretta was even a big part of making sure that things looked the way that they needed to and the interpretation was done right before her passing too. So a lot of work has gone into that. But to your point, to be able to sit in the pews, to look and see even the stained glass that's there, to see the dolls and how, family dinner was really important. It's set up that way for a Sunday dinner. Just things like that really kind of take you there, and it's really special. And it's all free.
Yeah, exactly. Talk about the Emmett Till Project in Mississippi. You mentioned the Medgar Evers Project, but talk about the Emmett Till Project.
Yeah, Emmett Till, man, that's heavy, right? Maybe because I'm a mom of a little boy. It's a passion project of mine. It's one of our newer parks in the Southeast, and it certainly take a lot of work. This year, well, no, we're in January now. So this past year, we were able to take a commemorative train ride from Chicago to Mississippi, and we were joined by Reverend Wheeler Parker, who was the best friend and cousin of Emmett. And they took that train ride down together this year will be 71 years ago, but 70 years ago, so him and his wife joined us. And it's powerful. But this park, it is headquartered, if you will, in Sumner, Mississippi. But it has 3 sites to it, one being Roberts Temple, which is in Chicago, and then the Grayball Landing, where Emmett was found by a young boy that was fishing. So we have those 3 sites. It's appropriately named after Emmett and his mother because, yes, it was a tragedy that happened to Emmett in August of 1955. But Mamie's work was just getting started, right? And so just to lift up the work and advocacy that she did there. And so that park is important, but something that I think is really needed and special is that myself working in the Southeast region, Crystal Davis, who's the Midwest regional manager, so regional director, so she's working to support efforts in Chicago. Both of us are Black women. Both of us are like, no, this has to be done appropriately. So being very intentional about that and just lifting it up and to show the connection. So we're constantly talking about, people leaving Mississippi, going to Chicago, the Great Migration, the impacts there, the connections there. talking about, a lot of people that were in Chicago were coming from Mississippi, like a lot of big names that we know about, right? Mamie herself was born in Mississippi. They have roots there. We talk about the closeness between the Till family that was in Chicago and leaders like Fred Hampton. We talk about the fact when Mamie was down in Mississippi, how she had connections, and Medgar Evers was very, very much right there and present and helping to find witnesses during that trial, about the leaders like TRM Howard, who did, a speech shortly. He was one keeping Mamie safe during the trial because Sumner was then, I get in trouble when I say that it still is, but I'll say it was then a sundown town. And so Mamie couldn't stay in Sumner where the trial was at the Tallahatchie courthouse. So she was going to Mound Bayou, talking about the significance and the importance of Mound Bayou and the safety that Black folks had in that space. But then to have Dr. TRM Howard leading the way that he was, and how he would, he would say a speech in Montgomery. And then less than 100 days later, there you have Rosa Parks and those efforts getting started for the bus boycott there. So just the connections between people. And so using this park to say, Emmett, like what happened to you was tragic, but we understand and we got you, right? And we're going to take care of this story. And the same for his mom, because there's a lot of sacrifice I wish that Emmett or Mamie didn't have to face, but to not, lose sight of that and make it a point to continue to elevate and share the sacrifice and the struggles that folks went to so that we can, live a better day to day.
Yeah, my dad and his sister were part of that migration from Mississippi to Chicago for me.
Okay.
And they didn't get all the way to Chicago. They got to Centralia, Illinois.
Okay.
Because my grandma met somebody else, and he worked for the railroad, Illinois Central Railroad, and their maintenance depot was in Centralia. Mm. But my dad eventually ended up in Chicago, and then that's where I was born. And so, of course, part of our experience growing up is we learn about Emmett Till. So naturally, when I told my dad, I think I'm going to Jackson State University to go to college, and he was like, "What? You going back to Mississippi? We were trying to get away from Mississippi." You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, and I ended up spending 34 years of my life down there. And then I had the privilege of meeting Miss Mamie because my aunt is named Mamie too. And, to meet her and just to be in her presence and talk about her son. And then we were dealing with a family member of hers who was, we think was murdered, but that's a whole nother podcast for another day. I may actually do a podcast about that case down the road, but just to be in her presence and stuff and the courage that she displayed during that whole time. It's just, it's a tragic story, but it's a compelling story. And it's something that we as people need to know. And I'm glad that you and others are connected to make sure that that story is told and preserved. I think that's key, because a lot of people don't understand, it's like, when we talk about the parks, and because that falls under the Department of Interior, right?
Right.
Yeah. So they, it's like either they say, well, this is white folk stuff or Native American stuff, right? This don't really concern Black folks. So, the fact that you and Ms. Davis and others are engaged in this kind of work and showing the significance of the power of the Park Service to tell our stories, I think is very, very important. So that leads me to my next to last question. What efforts are being made to get more African Americans involved in this conservation work?
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about the cultural resource side of it, right? And so I'll make a point to say that we are in deep conversation with groups like the Association of African American Museums or Carter G. Woodson's organization, ASALA. And so to make sure that we're all a part of those conversations, right? And bringing in we say big green organizations, but folks that have a responsibility. And you find a lot of Black folks who have been in the space and are like, oh, I'm here. Let me use my position and power to do that, right? So I think of Dr. Jocelyn Imani, who's with Trust for Public Land now. She used to be with the National Park Service. Think about people like Brent Leggs, who's working with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, right? They just restored Nina Simone's house. and in North Carolina. And so it's just people that are saying, I am in a position of power and responsibility. What am I going to do with it? Right. So doing that and lifting that up. But then you also have the natural resources side of it, or the environmental pieces. And so, we name names like Dr. Robert Bullard or Dr. Darcea Taylor, and people who are really leading the charge for the EJ work, and to show we were impacted by this work. We're still impacted by this work. We have nonprofits like the Hip Hop Caucus, where Reverend Yearwood is lifting a voice to this and say, hey, this stuff matters to you. This isn't just, to your point, this isn't just their problem or their history, and they aren't the people that have resources, and they aren't the people that are knowledgeable. It's our responsibility to do it too, because if not us, who? Right? People aren't thinking about us and prioritizing us in a way that we can't. And in fact, it's our responsibility to do it, because if we don't, they won't. And so just naming that. And so, as I said, with Roland Powell and Joy Reid, I mean, she just did a book on Medgar Evers, right? Like, these people are naming parks. And so we're finding ways to make it more relevant to all the generations. And I think that's really going to be important, because we got a lot of barriers against us, unfortunately. They're not new. Right. I say that the reason we've seen so many attacks against so many good things is because we did them well. So like, dang, these folks, when they come together, they actually know what they're doing. And so it's going to take more of that. But there's a lot of opportunity and hope in that. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it did. But it kind of led me to a follow-up. So is there any kind of thing with the HBCUs? Is there any kind of connection there? Or is that something that's being explored? I would say that would fall in your lap, because a lot of HBCUs would be in the states that you work in.
Right.
But is there some kind of program? Because I remember when I was in the state legislature, we NBCSL meetings, we had the USDA come in, and they were setting up a program to get Black students, especially
1890 Scholars.
Huh?
The 1890 Scholars Program.
Yeah. And so, it was just, so is there something similar to that connected with the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So in a couple of ways. Prior to last year, there was funding. So on the National Park Service side, I'll start there. There were opportunities for the National Park Service to provide grants to HBCUs to help with some of that historic preservation work, which was really important. We also have some parks that are centered within an HBCU. So Tuskegee, for example, they have the George Washington Carver Museum. They also have the Booker T. Washington home, known as the Oaks, right there on campus. Their headquarters is adjacent to the campus in and of itself. We see intentional partnerships with places like, maybe the story isn't connected, but making a point to have connection with the students with like Fort Monroe and Hampton or Norfolk State, just because of proximity, right? So things like that are happening. But I'll say too, with my position before I came to NPCA, I was fortunate to work with the chief of youth programs, and we created the HBCUI program. So Historically Black Colleges and Universities internship, right? And so we were recruiting students solely from HBCUs and placing them at parks. When the program first got started, it was sites that focused on cultural resources. But over time, we just hit year 14. We said, hey, it's time that this evolve, because our students are evolving. They're not just interested in journalism and history, which is great. If that's what you want to do it, right? We need more of those folks. But if you're interested in engineering, or you're interested in geography or archaeology, like, there's an opportunity for you. You're also needed in these spaces. And so they're working over the summer. And what's special about that program is when they finish their program, after you achieve a certain amount of hours, they were getting a hiring authority. And so if anybody's ever applied for federal jobs, if you're not a vet, it's almost impossible to get hired. So those hiring authorities made it a lot easier. There's a direct hiring authority. There's a public land corps hiring authority. It made it a whole lot easier for those students to, go through the program, graduate, and then get a federal position within the National Park Service. And so just really excited to kind of see those things come together. There's been a lot of successes. I think the beautiful part of HBCUI, I'm biased, but in that some of the people that we recruited when they were sophomores, juniors, seniors in the program are now the supervisors for some of the current interns that are working. So it's something that they believed in, they're passionate about. Me being in my position with NPCA, why I don't run the program anymore, a lot of my partners at the park, the rangers, are my former students, right? And so it's really full circle and it's really personal for me, but it's exciting. And it just also just shows the power of HBCUs, because going to these spaces and being the only person, or going to these very remote spaces where it's just like, where are we? What are we doing? This is what they talked about in the history books. You know what I mean? Like I'm seeing it live and in living color. Like, but to say I can do this, right? Because I know I have community, whether it be school, whether it be the folks, from the program or mentors or things like that. And so just really exciting. But yeah, there's a few efforts that are still happening to make sure that those connections are there. And then I myself with MPCA, call a spade a spade. We are a very white organization. I mean, you can just see it if you look at the staff page, right? But to your point, these HBCUs are right in my backyard. And I live in Atlanta, right? So to say I can't get to an HBCU is absurd. And so I make a point to do programming at HBCUs as often as possible, talk to interns, professors, things like that, to make sure they're connected with the parks in the area and that they are a part of that work to advocate for these places.
Yeah. Well, Jackson State has a school of engineering. I just thought I'd throw that out there. I didn't know if you...
That's right. But we've gotten a lot of folks from Jackson State that end up at New Orleans Jazz because that band is pretty bad, man. It's pretty bad. And so they want to end up playing for that park.
That's right. Last question.
Sure.
Oh, no, before I ask this question, I had a woman on, I guess a couple of years ago now, Rachel Kerr Williams, and she's kind of taken over the preservation of a Black cemetery. Now, I think a lot of the stuff that she was dealing with was with land trust preservation. Does the Park Service get engaged with any Black cemetery preservation, or is that strictly under land trust?
It can get dicey. The first one that pops in mind is Vicksburg, right? And you're talking about the U.S. colored troops. There's more work that can be done. It really just kind of depends. Now, that's something that's come up to me. One of my parks in North Carolina is Fort Raleigh. And so we had an HBCU intern that was working there, and she found out that there was a Black cemetery. And right now it's under either the airport or the aquarium, something like that. So just like blatant erasure. And so there's a lot of conversations that need to happen over that. Right now, I would probably say the biggest thing is going to be U.S. colored troops. And so it's not that it's a special cemetery for them. It's just there happen to be Black folks that are there where they're honoring other folks that have fallen and are buried. But more work can certainly be done there.
Yeah, I attended a ceremony where they reinterred some Black Union soldiers at the Grand Gulf Cemetery in Gibson. Yeah. So I was just curious about that. All right. So let's close it out with this. Finish this sentence. I have hope because
they're coming at us so hard. So we must have figured out how to do this.
Yeah, I understand. All right. So Dr. Goddard, first of all, thank you for doing this.
Of course.
I when I came across your profile, I said, this is a discussion we need to have, because I'm all about history, and the work that you have been doing and the Park Service directly has been doing is really, really commendable in helping us tell our story, to remind the nation that our story is a part of the overall American story.
Absolutely.
So if people, and is the National Parks Conservation Association, it's a nonprofit, right?
Correct.
So how can people get in touch? How can people donate, get involved? How can they reach you? Just go ahead and do your spiel.
Sure. So we have a robust communications team. They're working around the clock. It's a pretty big department that we have here. And so npca.org, you can find quite a bit of information. If you want to email me, you can always reach out to me that way, epreston@npca.org. You can give me a phone call if you need to, 404-399-4500. I try to make myself accessible to the folks that want to have these conversations and do the work. Or there's new opportunity. People give me calls all the time to say, I got an idea for a park. Like, let's do it, right? Let's have those conversations. But if you want to get involved with advocacy, you can quite literally go to the same website, npca.org, and put advocacy, and all the legislation that's out there. If you want to write a member to Congress, you want to figure out how to just engage and use your voice. All those resources are there. It's all free. If you want to donate, you can do that too, but not to take money away from our organization, even though we are a nonprofit. Look at those local organizations too that are doing this important work and see how you can build community with them, whether it be your time, talent, or treasure, right? And so it takes all of us to do the work. And so if NPCA is the way that you get your start, I'm happy to do that, but we can certainly have conversations about how to advance it as a community.
Well, again, Dr. Eboni Preston Goddard, I am honored to have had this conversation with you, and I'm glad that you were able to come on. And the rule is that I have an open invitation. Once you've been a guest, you have an open invitation to come back. And so if there's anything new in your world that you want to share, feel free to reach out and we'll make that happen. So thank you again for coming on.
Sounds good. I appreciate that. We got a couple parks in the works, so I'll definitely take you up on that.
All right. That sounds like a plan. All right, guys, we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now it is time for my next guest, George Ornado. Indianapolis raised George Ornado is stepping up to fight for it. George grew up and still lives on the north side where he learned the values that guide him every day: hard work, resilience, and a deep commitment to community. Those lessons shaped who he is and inspired his career in public service. Throughout his public life, George worked at the highest levels of state and national Democratic politics, including serving in the Obama administration at the U.S. Department of Justice. Whether it was working on civil rights or leading national outreach efforts at the Obama Foundation to reimagine policing, George focused on bringing people together to solve tough challenges. George also believes education is a cornerstone of opportunity. After graduating from Cornell, Harvard, and George Washington University Law School, George dedicated his career to advancing policies that expand access to resources, building safer neighborhoods, and creating economic opportunity. Now George is running for Congress to bring that experience home. Indianapolis deserves leadership with the vision and determination to take on our toughest challenges and deliver results for every Hoosier. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, George Ornado. All right. George Ornado. How you doing, sir? You doing good?
I cannot complain. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Like I was saying in the warm up, I'm doing better than you because you're running for office, and I don't have to do that anymore.
You know the grind.
Yeah, yeah, especially at the federal level. And so we'll get into all of this stuff that you're doing, but normally how I start the interviews off is that I do a couple of icebreakers. Mm-hmm. So the first icebreaker is a quote that I want you to respond to. And this is your quote. Call me whatever you want. Just call me effective.
I still love hearing it. It's a bar. But I mean, look, I think in our politics, we've gotten too into labels and factions and, purity and things like that. I'm running a field first campaign. We're on the doors every single day. We're phone banking every single day. We've already knocked over 33,000 doors, made over 60,000 phone calls, right? Most people are not thinking of themselves in the ways that those of us that are hyper political think about themselves, right? They just want to see results. They don't know whether an issue comes from, is going to be solved by the federal, state, or local government. They want to see results. They don't know whether something is seen as quote unquote progressive or quote unquote moderate. They just want to see results. The left, right, or left center binary, in our politics, to the extent that it was ever informative, I don't think it's informative for this moment in time. I think the fundamental split in the party right now is not progressive versus moderate or young versus old, and even fighters versus folders doesn't necessarily get to it. I think it's between those that see our systems and institutions as largely working, and that we simply need to protect them and manage this period of decline, versus those like myself that that say, hey, obviously we want to protect everything we have as best as we can, but we also have to acknowledge that we don't have a lot of power right now. And we are just a year into this, and government already, has done a total 180. So whenever Democrats come back into power, I think, this chaos will bring about an opportunity to rebuild. And the question becomes, do we rebuild back to what we had, which I don't think was sufficiently meeting and serving the needs of people? Or do we have the imagination to think about what it can be? And so I think we need a whole new reconstruction, quite frankly. And, as we look to that, the ways in which we've seen and felt and talked about politics before doesn't matter. It's got to be about results. And so if we're going to have a binary, I'd rather it be, not left versus right, but I'd rather it be up versus down, because I could give a damn on whether something is seen as progressive or moderate or even conservative. Are we materially improving people's lives and helping solve the issues that folks are seeing every day? So that's kind of what drives me.
Got you. All right. So now the next icebreaker is called 20 questions. So I need you to give me a number between 1 and 20.
11.
All right. Where do you go to check a fact that you see, hear, or read?
A couple of different places. One, I'll check Twitter and see, how much something's being talked about and who's talking about it. And, I'll look into those sorts of bios, because it's a quick way to, I can get a New York Times and a CBS and, all sorts of outlets and see if people are talking about something, so that's kind of where I start. And then I'll delve deeper.
Okay. All right. So I have a simple first question for you. Why politics?
It's sport with consequence. And look, I love the Pacers. I love the Colts, but whoever wins the Super Bowl, whoever wins the NBA Finals, it doesn't, outside of, hometown pride, it doesn't materially affect my life 20 years down the road. But whoever we elect to public office does. And, I've been interested in public policy ever since I was young, and in part driven by my own kind of, background. My parents were high school sweethearts who married young, had me while in college. And, in those early years, I don't want to overstate it. I had a great childhood, but, we struggled. I was, for a brief period of time, a WIC baby on government formula. And, as I got older, I think of that as a tangible example of how in my own life, the positive impact that government can have, on people. And so, in our, two-party system, right, I'm a Democrat because of the values, that I believe the party stands for. Big Ten, as big a tent as it may be, it's the values that we're pushing for and the different approaches that, folks within the party may have. I look at things from the lens of how does something serve the underserved child, right? So that's kind of a North Star for me, as it comes to the policy side of things. But the flip side of that coin is the political side of things. I am deeply competitive, and like I said, it's sport with consequence, and I'm 5'7.5", and I give myself that half, so I knew I wasn't going to play, college or professional sports. And so, this is my arena. And so how do we, improve people's lives and do the work day in and day out, and honestly try and make people feel seen and heard again in our politics? Because, as I'm hitting these doors, it is so clear the disconnect between the Democratic Party and the people that we claim to serve. It is so clear that people are disillusioned and disengaged and don't feel not just represented, but don't feel like there is a place for them to come into. And so, with this campaign, we're trying to build the vehicle, for people to put their energies, put their passions, get involved. And especially in a community like Indianapolis, where this is the, lowest performing congressional district in the whole state in voter turnout, in a state that is already 50th out of all 50 states in DC in voter turnout. And, we may be in a blue dot and have a Democratic mayor, Democratic member of Congress, a supermajority on the city county council, Democratic state legislators. But if we're not pulling our weight as a community, we're hurting not just ourselves, but we're a drag on Democrats across the whole state. Because back when the party was competing, even winning statewide, it's in large part because Indianapolis, this congressional district, was organized. It was the best congressional district in the state in voter turnout. Now we're the worst. And so that's some of the work that that I'm doing. It's not just from a policy perspective, but it's how do we rebuild the party that, knows how to fight for people again and that brings people into the fold as opposed to gatekeeps and, tries to rule over the ashes of, a broken, disorganized operation.
Okay. All right. So that does lead me into my next question.
Mm-hmm.
You are challenging a Democratic incumbent in your primary.
Mm-hmm.
The seat has been held by one family since 1997.
Mm-hmm.
The incumbent is an African American and a Muslim. How do you plan to overcome all those landmines to get elected?
Meet people. Be out in community. I mean, look, I like the incumbent a lot. I respect him up until this, race. We had a good relationship, but, sometimes we got to tell the truth. And the truth is that the Center for Effective Lawmaking consistently ranks him as one of the least effective members of Congress, across both parties and across both the House and the Senate. In 18 years in office, the only two things that he has been the lead sponsor on that have been signed into law is renaming a federal building and naming a memorial. We are lagging behind peer cities across the country in how much federal funds we're bringing home. I know how to do that side of the job. In private practice, I've represented the African American Mayors Association, the cities of Birmingham, Jackson, Little Rock, Miami-Dade County, and in just, 3 years have brought nearly $800 million to those communities across a range of projects. Whereas the incumbent in 18 years as a member of Congress touts, about $1 billion brought to the district, when most of that is federal formula funding that was going to come in to the district regardless of who was in the seat, right? So I think we need somebody that's going to be more proactive in the role. Two, I talked about the party building piece of this being our only safe Democratic seat in our congressional delegation. So I think whoever sits there needs to not only be, our representative with a vision for the community and the work ethic to execute upon it, but also take on that party building and party leadership role. And so as I'm out there on the doors, there are a couple different things that I'm hearing. I am hearing, first and foremost, thank you, which at this point, when people say it, I know where they're going with it. But earlier on, I was like, you're welcome. But for what? and they say, for showing up. You're the first candidate. You're the first elected official that I've had actually knock on my door and, ask my opinion. And as proud as I am of that, I think it's also an indictment on the state of the party here in Indiana and on some of the leadership like Congressman Carson that we have that's been a little bit complacent. And so we need to bring people into the fold and energize them. I think number two is we're seeing people that just feel so disillusioned, so dejected that we have 20 years of one party Republican rule here in Indiana. So you don't typically see congressional candidates talking about party building. You see them talking about specific policy issues. But the way that I see it is that this is a safe Democratic seat. Whoever is in it is going to be largely a safe Democratic vote. So my issue with Congressman Carson is not about his voting record so much as it is how he uses the role. The systems and the structural aspect of things, and presence is important, at large. People don't feel, like leadership, is present. And so they want to feel somebody that's on the ground, that's not, you probably hear that phrase a lot in Democratic politics of like, meet people where they are. I hate that phrase because to me, it carries with it this implication of kind of coming down from one's perch, right? Be with the plebeians, sort of like vibe. For me, it's you should just be in community walking alongside people to begin with, right? So how are we doing more to kind of engage and connect and make people feel hope again?
Yeah. I like the way that you broke that down about meeting people where they are, because it seems like an innocuous phrase. But yeah, that top down kind of politics. I think now that the signal is going out that's not where we need to be.
And I mean, look, my career is largely the National Democratic Political Operative, right? Did a whole bunch in Obama world, served in the Obama administration doing civil rights work with the Department of Justice, whole bunch of presidential campaign headquarters from Obama in 2012, Clinton in 16, national delegate director and then deputy political director. For Buttigieg did Biden voter protection in 2020 before doing a lot of that municipal representation that I referenced earlier, in the private sector, and then eventually starting my own company to do similar work. So I know what the rules of the game are, so to speak, right? And I know you know it too, where it's, you raise money, you hoard that money until the final 6 to 8 weeks, and then you broadcast and spend it on paid media to reach people. I don't think that model works anymore. I don't think it's what our country needs or what our politics, our party needs. And so I think we need to get back to the basics, right? Nothing I'm doing is new, being out here organizing, but we just kind of stopped doing it. We need to get to bottom up. And so, I came into this campaign saying, look, I know how to run that race, but if I didn't know that those were the rules of the game, so to speak, how do I think campaign should be run? And so the way I think about this is this campaign is a vehicle, not just to elect myself, hopefully, but to rebuild the party from the bottom up, like I spoke a little bit towards. In the wake of the redistricting fight that we had here in Indiana, and, thankfully we, successfully pushed back on that, I pivoted my campaign to be a vehicle for grassroots defense. So in short order, my scrappy grassroots campaign became the largest Democratic field operation in the state of Indiana to combat redistricting. So again, similar to people telling me thank you for showing up, it's something I'm proud about, but it is also an indictment on the state of the party here. It shouldn't be me, outperforming the state party, outperforming the congressman, outperforming the Democratic mayor or any of our Democratic leaders. But that's just what it came down to. Another thing is with the congressional shutdown, the government shutdown in November and the food stamps lapse, that got me thinking about how can this campaign be a vehicle for mutual aid. And so one of the things that I thought about is, how the Black Panthers had their universal or their free breakfast program, right? And so to me, that's an example of a great way to show how any given entity adds value to community, and it can be an on-ramp into that entity, political or otherwise, right? And so, I've been meeting with all sorts of folks from faith leaders to neighborhood association presidents to, grassroots organizations. And so I thought, okay, how can I connect the dots, here? If this organization has resources, but they don't have bodies and volunteers, this group over here has the passion and the volunteers, but they don't have the resources. And everybody's trying to figure out what can we do in this moment, when government has failed us to step up for community, neighbors looking after neighbors. Then let me try and connect folks, right? Or if I've got this big list of all these sorts of people I've been doing, outreach to, let me do some research, not just on the resources, for food security and hunger here in Indianapolis, but across the state. And let me push it out to that email list and say, hey, this is a living sheet, crowdsourced. If you see anything on here that needs edits, let me know. If you know of any resources that aren't on here, let me know. Just like that, over about 150 entries on it. So these are the things, right, to where we talk about power. There's actual power and there's symbolic power. As Democrats, in D.C. in particular, but including also here in the state of Indiana, we may not have a lot of actual power, but it doesn't mean that we don't have symbolic power that we can use. We've got convening power. We can collaborate. We can connect folks. We can, kind of play that role in our own communities. And so I see campaigns as a window into how one will govern. And so that's why I've tried to approach this campaign, in that sort of way.
Yeah. When you were talking about cities that you worked with, it was really, really cool to hear Jackson, Mississippi in that conversation, considering I spent like 34 years there.
Oh, wow.
But Indianapolis is also a very special city to me. My mom was born and raised there. She went to Shortridge High School, as a matter of fact.
Okay. Amazing.
And I spent many a summer there in my youth, hanging out with my many, many first cousins. What are the issues that Indy residents are dealing with that you feel you can change or improve?
So I've got on my website, the vision page, right? I've got a national agenda that I call the Fair Shot Agenda. And that has 5 different buckets under it. It's an economy that works, a stronger foundation, a safer city, a sustainable future, and a democracy that puts people first. Within those, it's a slew of different policy positions. And they all kind of fall under the bucket of the Fair Shot Agenda because I referenced, earlier a little bit about my background growing up, and you've heard a little bit about my professional background and experiences, and I've been able to have some great educational opportunities as well. Went to Cornell for undergrad, Harvard for my master's in education policy, George Washington University for law school. And look, I've been very fortunate. I've achieved my own American dream, but I can't overlook the fact that is increasingly out of reach for more and more people. So to me, the issue that I've always been most animated by personally is poverty, because I think it is the single biggest, most shameful policy failure in this country. But I see poverty not as a specific issue so much as it is a lens and framework by which to look at every other issue, whether it be jobs and economic development, housing and urban development, environmental justice, educational and health, outcomes and disparities. And I think about the fact that 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 5, kids here in the district live in poverty. That is as shocking as it is unacceptable. And that's based off metrics developed 60 years ago by the Department of Labor when, food was 1/3 of a household's expenses, and now it's 1/8. And so the United Way of Central Indiana has their own metric system called ALICE, Asset Living Income Compensated and Employed, where essentially it's, hey, you may not technically be in poverty, but you're just barely making it. And so with their metric system, it shows that 40% of folks here in Marion County, Indianapolis, live in poverty. And in some of these neighborhoods, it's as high as 77, 80%. That's unbelievable. That's ridiculous and just completely unacceptable in the United States of America in, 2026. And, it's not unique to us at the same time. And so that's where that Fair Shot Agenda comes in. And that's a national thing. But I also have 3 kind of policy white papers, in conjunction working with policy experts and folks here on the ground in Indianapolis, that do this work day in and day out on the 3 issues that I've heard the most about on the doors from community members. Number 1, you may not believe it, but is roads. We are the worst in the entire state in infrastructure. And the state is ranked dead last in the country in infrastructure. Our craters are like potholes, right? And it's a $500 million a year shortfall, to be able to address it at the scale that's needed. So this is something that seems so basic, and it's something that doesn't discriminate. These roads are tearing up everybody's cars, right? But it's also one of those things where there's inequity of, what roads are getting fixed first, right? And, if you're somebody that's struggling and living paycheck to paycheck and you bust a tire and that's an unexpected expense, right? There's an economic argument to all this too, right? So fix the damn roads, is a white paper and a plan that I have around that I hear constantly throughout the district. The other one is make housing affordable. We've got about half of the district, that rent. And, there's even more of the district, that don't cleanly fall into the rent versus, ownership side of things. Because, as I'm canvassing across the city, you see how many of these houses are multi-generation, right? You'll have, grandmother and, her son and, the 6-year-old grandson, right? And this is how a lot of folks in the community are growing up. And it's not, sometimes it's cultural, right? But oftentimes it's just need. It's necessity. It's you don't have the ability to go off on your own and buy something. So that's a reality in this. So we've got a plan for that. And then homelessness, is a really big issue here in the community. And with all of these things, one of the things that I often hear from people is, oh, well, that's a local issue. Oh, well, that's a state issue, right? But what I say to people is anything that's a local or state issue can also be a federal issue, right? Let's take roads as an example. If I am a more proactive member of Congress, bringing home more federal funds on any given issue, does that free up, the city budget to put more money towards, roads. Or even beyond that. I may not like what Republicans are doing right now in DC, but we can't say that they don't think outside of the box. So where are we thinking outside of the box with things? So I think about, the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Program. Not to get too granular, but, it is a federal funding formula program where there is a set amount of money that will flow through to the state, for any given issue. And Indianapolis is not unlike a lot of the cities that I've represented, Democratic cities, often but not always capital cities in Republican states, just like Jackson, right? Where there is a dynamic between the Republican leadership in the state trying to stick it to that Democratic city. And what it often means is that cities like, Indianapolis and Jackson don't see its fair share of resources. And so how can we put together some sort of coalition to advocate for rethinking that federal funding formula so that it takes some of these nuances into account and communities like ours aren't left behind? Something like that wouldn't just have a transformative impact when it comes to roads, but on any given issue in which there's a federal, formula program. And so these are the sorts of things that I think about. And I guess also one of the things that I think about that I referenced earlier is people aren't thinking about what's solved by the federal government versus state versus local. They just want solutions, right? And so how do we break down the silos between every level of government? Because look, vision building is not easy. Rallying people around a vision is even harder. Executing upon a vision is arguably the hardest. But unless you have a vision, then you are walking aimlessly. And I feel like as a community here from a vision and policy perspective, as a state, we've been walking aimlessly. I feel like the Democratic Party here in Indianapolis, here in Indiana, across the country, we're walking aimlessly. And so we need leaders that have a vision. We need leaders that have the work ethic to execute and rally people around such vision. And so that's what I'm trying to bring to the table here.
Yeah. All right. So are Hoosiers concerned about the Epstein files?
Yeah. That's actually one of the things that has surprised me on the doors. It's not like I'm going door to door and saying like, hey, what do you think about the Epstein files? Right. But, people are talking to me constantly about the issues that are most important to them. And that's not top of mind, or it's not something people are offering up. To me, it is something I am personally very interested in because I see it as bigger than just a crime, right? To me, this is an issue of equal justice. If we cannot trust in our justice system that it is going to be applied to everybody, then how does that erode, the way that we see our institutions? There shouldn't be a different set of rules for the wealthy and the powerful, the elite, the connected. And that's what we've been seeing. And so I think this is something that we need something more akin to like the 9/11 Commission, to really look at it and root everything out. And it makes me think as a parallel sort of side of things, I've never been one for litmus tests because I think it distracts from, building governing coalitions. But with everything that we're seeing across the country right now and with the Trump administration and just thinking back to the other day in Minneapolis with the tragic, murder there, we need leaders that especially in 2028 when thinking from presidential candidates, we need folks that aren't just going to, in a post-Trump era, talk about moving on and talk about healing. I believe that we can't heal until there's a reckoning, and so we have to, sunlight is the best disinfectant. We have to root out, all the corruption that we're seeing and bring folks to justice for it. There has to be accountability because if there's not, then how do we take any of this seriously? And so, I feel the same way on that with respect to Epstein files. I don't care who surfaced in it. It could be Democrat. It could be Republican. It doesn't matter. It's not about party. It's not about tribalism, getting into your corners. People have to be held accountable for their actions. Simple as that.
Yeah. So since you brought up the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis, do you feel that ICE, as it's currently constructed, needs to be abolished, or is
Of
there
course.
some workaround that you can
No,
envision?
I mean, no. ICE absolutely needs to be abolished, in its form now. But, honestly, abolishing ICE is, the moderate position at this point. It's not just that. It's we need to, you know, highlight who these folks are that are, behaving in this manner, right? And not just Minneapolis. We saw in Chicago a couple months ago. You've got ICE agents that are, using pepper spray on Chicago police. So what happened to all the folks that talk about the idea of Blue Lives Matter, right? And so it's like we have to be consistent when we're talking about things, not just, oh, it's convenient when it's for something I want, but otherwise it's not, right? And so for me, I understand that politics is a game of teams and this and that. I don't play that, right? I play like, what are the values? What are the beliefs? What are the systems? What are the structures that we need? Putting people first. How are we thinking about like the impact on folks at the end of the day? And everything else is noise. Everything else is theater.
Yeah. I think you kind of answered my question about the supporting the Democrats' position during the government shutdown. Do you support the United States making Venezuela a U.S. territory by capturing Nicolas Maduro?
Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, it's like we got rising utility rates and all these data centers. We've got, groceries through the roof. I mean, damn, I ordered some Taco Bell the other day on Uber Eats, and I was like, when did it get this expensive, right? Like we've got folks, struggling with healthcare cost, everything across the board. It shouldn't be this hard to get by. And Trump talked about trying to address these issues and the affordability crisis, yet here he is doing everything else but that. So it's like we got to keep our eye on the ball and do what actually, affects people here at home, not, be trying to do anything and everything all over the world. And so it's just a whole mess what we're seeing right now.
So in light of that, do you support military aid to Ukraine, and do you support military aid to Israel?
I mean, military aid to Ukraine in this moment, absolutely. Military aid to Israel in this moment, I don't believe that we should be, providing offensive weapons to any nation unless it is in accordance with international humanitarian law. And that's just simply not what we've been seeing.
Yeah. Taking into account that less than 10% of your state's population is as African American, what is your position on reparations?
I hear that all the time. And my question is like, what exactly, like, I know what it means, right? But like, walk it out for me, right? And so I think I'm always open to study, so I could be told, what would this look like? Is it X amount of money to Y amount of people, right? Like it's a buzzword at this point, but it's never actually been, flowed out. I think what's more helpful and what I think about is how do we repair systems so that there's not, discriminatory effects? How do we make sure that there's, equity in anything that we do, moving forward, and that we're not, inhibiting communities, especially communities that have a history of being, marginalized and underserved. How do we think from a policy perspective, trying to think of a concrete example, right? We talked a little bit about poverty earlier, right? Poverty is something that hits everybody, but it disproportionately affects, Black and brown communities, right? And to your question, I guess, with the Black community. So what are we doing to make sure that we are decreasing, poverty, right? What are we doing to make sure that, everybody has the healthcare that they need, right? What are we doing to make sure that everybody has, the food that they need, right? And so all of these difficult issues, have a disproportionate effect on communities of color, right? And so doing more to put resources towards that, I think, is a way of repair in my mind. And so a budget is a moral document. And I also believe that a country or a community is only as strong as its most vulnerable. And the fact that we have so many people struggling still is an indictment on our priorities. And so I believe in repair, absolutely. But it is about the way of getting there. And so The way of getting there in my mind comes through working within systems or building new systems to allow for everybody to thrive and live lives of dignity and success. If there are other ways of getting there, I'm always open to it, but I'd love to see kind of that laid out, what it looks like.
Yeah. And so HR 40 has been a bill that's been introduced ever since John Conyers has been pushing it, I guess, in 89. Mm-hmm. And so that bill is basically just to create what you were referring to as a study committee to kind of get to what are the issues and what can Congress do or what should the federal government do. And so if HR 40 came before you for a vote, you would
support it.
Favor that. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Since the circuits of the U.S. Court of Appeals are assigned a circuit justice from the United States Supreme Court, and there are 13 courts of appeal circuits, would you vote for an expansion of the U.S. Supreme Court to 13 justices?
Absolutely. I think we also need term limits on justices. We need term limits on, members of Congress.
What do you think is a fair, because in your case, you'd have to get elected 3 times before you get vested and get that lifetime check. So what would be?
I put 18 years.
Okay.
That's in my policy platform. 18 years for members of Congress.
Okay. Why is 2026 going to be a blue wave for Democrats?
I mean, you've got folks in the Trump coalition that are falling off for different issues. For some, it's because of the impacts of terrorists. For others, it's because of Epstein files. It's going to continue to be the case, right? We're seeing chaos instead of competence. We're seeing, like we talked about, a focus on everybody but Americans. We're seeing, we are not seeing what Trump promised his voters. And they're seeing that too, which is why his popularity is, declining rapidly. It's because his popularity is declining rapidly and his knowledge that if Democrats win the House, they'll have investigative powers and authorities to look into his corruption. It's because of that why the redistricting fight started. It began in Texas. What he didn't expect is that Gavin Newsom and California Democrats, were going to respond, on their side. He didn't anticipate that Texas Democrats in the House would break quorum and inspire the nation on this. He didn't anticipate that it would then become this, race to the bottom of states, both blue states and red states, looking at redistricting, eventually making it what might end up being a wash. He didn't anticipate that, Kansas would back off. He didn't anticipate that, Republicans here in Indiana, a majority of Republicans in the state Senate caucus would vote with Democrats to beat this down after a 4.5 month, saga around this. He is realizing that he doesn't have the juice that he used to have. He is realizing, in real time, everybody becomes a lame duck at some point. Right. And so that's why he is digging in. That's why he is trying to distract, from his losses. He's trying to distract from Epstein files. And he's, waving, a little shiny thing over here with Venezuela. Oh, okay. Let me bomb Nigeria on Christmas. Oh, okay. Let me go into Syria and this and that. That's why he is putting, election deniers, in important posts as it comes to that. That's why he's getting, National Guard in communities across the country so he can, normalize that. Because when the idea people often talk about, the Republicans are moving right now, like we're not going to have elections. The way I think about it, it's less likely that we're not going to have elections, but, are they free and fair? Right? Are people going, to turn out, in Democratic precincts, if they're afraid about ICE, right? Or are they going to feel intimidated because there's a military presence, right? These are the sorts of things, from a soft power perspective and a hard power perspective that they still try and get their way, right? And so, it is up to us as a people to stay vigilant, to continue doing the work, to continue to stand up, to bring others into the fold, to not be afraid, because the power of the people is always stronger than the people in power. And we have to remember that, and keep pushing.
All right. So my final question for you is, finish this sentence. I have hope because
I believe in people.
Okay. Well, that's a good way to do it. If you're going to be in public service, you need to believe in the folks. And, I really appreciate the fact that you are putting yourself out there. I think one of the cool things about this process is that when it is done right, it is an incredible aim to be in public service. And it's an incredible commitment to take care of people. And, listening to you talk, I know that your heart is in the right place. And I greatly appreciate you taking the time to share that with me.
No, thank you.
If people want to get involved with your campaign or want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
I'm accessible. I put my cell phone number, my email out there all over the community when I'm dropping cards and canvassing. So, anybody has any, thoughts to share, questions, to ask, want to get involved, my website is georgehornado.com. There's a volunteer button. We're phone banking every single day. We're canvassing every day for those that are local here in Indianapolis. Obviously, resources are helpful and keep our scrappy grassroots campaign, going and try and reach more voters. But also my email is just george@georgehornado.com. So drop me a line and let's chat. So thank you to everybody for listening and thank you, Eric, for the opportunity and the platform, and deeply appreciative of the work that you do and had a good time with us.
Well, I'm glad that you had a good time. And one of the rules that I have is that once you've been a guest, you have an open invitation to come back. So it'd be cool if you're a member of Congress and you come back to the show. But even if you're not, I know that you're going to be active regardless of the results. So again, I greatly appreciate you taking the time and doing this.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, guys. And we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right. And we are back. So I want to thank Naomi, Raquel, Enright, Dr. Elizabeth Preston Goddard, and George Hornado for coming on the program. I've been working to try to get Sister Enright on for a while, and we finally were able to make that happen. And I'm glad that she was the first person that I got to interview in this new year. And I think her book, even though it was written several years ago, is very, very relevant to where we are today, because there's definitely a need to have strength in our soul as events have transpired over this last week. Dr. Goddard is doing incredible work in making sure that our history is interwoven. Well, it's been interwoven, but we just need somebody to tell the story. And Dr. Goddard is doing the work to make sure that our stories are told and that people understand that the contributions of African Americans have been and continue to be vital. And also just to deal with our national parks, because the initial reason why the Park Service was created and that there was an effort is because we wanted to reflect the beauty of this nation. And where sometimes the people and the leadership don't reflect it, nature is nature. And we don't think that every piece of land needs to be a tool of capitalism. Whether it's housing developments or oil rigs or whatever. Just some places just need to be preserved for the natural beauty that it is. And so I'm glad that Dr. Goddard is involved in that work. And especially, again, to show that African Americans care about this nation more than just their own self-interest, right? And then there's George Hornado, a young man after my own heart who is running for the United States Congress in the, I believe, the 7th district in Indiana. I might be wrong on that one, but he's running basically out of Indianapolis. And, I just can't help but see a lot of myself in his candidacy. Somebody that is committed to working for the people and offering themselves up and challenging a formidable incumbent to do so. But, it's just, we're at this point now where we've got to challenge things. And one of the things I didn't get a chance to ask him was about this trend, but he answered it in the interview, even without me asking, about why it's important to challenge things. I think, the status quo always needs to be shaken up at some point. And, I'm one of those people that, if somebody, doesn't matter if they're black, they're white, they're Democrat or Republican, if they're not responding to the people, if they're just place sitters, then we, at the very least, need to get them off of the spot that they're just sitting on, right? If we can't defeat them, at least make them move. And understand that, there's an accountability piece there. It's one thing to have the title. It's another thing to utilize that power for the maximum amount of good, right? And so I commend George for doing that. And if you are so inclined to help him, please do. So I guess the best way to get into what I want to talk about, because there were so many things, the situation in Venezuela, which even Jack Ryan, the TV show, saw coming. I've said what I needed to say about certain things. I think, this country has a history of using military force to enact police actions. I don't endorse that kind of stuff. I don't endorse the United States trying to be imperial. I think we have enough issues and really enough people. You're talking about a country of 330 million plus. I think it's a daunting enough task to make sure that each one of them have opportunities, let alone trying to meddle in other people's politics. And history has shown that meddling in other people's politics doesn't always garner the outcomes in the long term that we may have desired. There might be some short-term gains, but in the long term, that can flip. You look at the situation in Iran, for a historical example. You look at the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary, right? And how that has not had the desired effects that we have wanted, or we may have desired, whether the intentions were pure or not in this hemisphere. And the police actions on Manuel Noriega and Nicolas Maduro are examples of how that meddling has not benefited us or the citizens of their respective countries. So, there's that. But at 9:30 a.m. on January 7th, 2026, a 37-year-old woman who was a mother and had just dropped her child off from school and saw something going on in her community that she and other people in that city of Minneapolis were concerned about, which is the invasion of U.S. Immigration and Customs enforcement officers, agents in their town. The president has bragged that it's the largest show of force from the agency in history. But again, at 9:30 that morning, Renee Nicole Good became a victim of unjustified police violence. Now, a court of law may disagree with my assessment, but from what I saw, there's no way that you can say, and with my background in law enforcement, there's no way that you can say that that was a justified homicide, that that was a justified shooting. And it's something that a lot of us were dreading to happen. And it's been a little more than 5 years and literally 6 blocks away from where George Floyd was killed by law enforcement. It's in the same city where Philando Castile was killed by law enforcement. And I apologize to the family. I can't remember the young lady's name who was about to get married, who was killed in her backyard after calling the police to be killed by the police. This is, the common phrase is like, well, this is not what America is. Unfortunately, this is what America is. The challenge is, at what point do we do better? The Vice President of the United States, and we had already heard the president or read his tweet, and Kristi Noem, the Secretary over Homeland Security, tried to defend this officer, and his name is getting out there. They've been trying to shield him ever since the incident occurred. Sources are saying the man's name is Jonathan Ross. It'll probably be the last time I say it. But when the vice president got up, J.D. Vance, and said that and tried to berate the press and basically with his full chest come out and support murder. See, it's one thing to do like a Holman, to say, well, look, we need to investigate this. We need to get the facts. It's a terrible thing that happened. It's never a good thing when an officer has to use their weapon, and we're going to do a thorough investigation and find out the truth. But that's not what J.D. Vance said. J.D. Vance basically said she deserved to die. And I will say with my full chest, that's bullshit. Nobody deserves to die, and especially for their political viewpoints, and especially if their political viewpoints are opposite mine or anybody else's, right? I want J.D. Vance to say that to that 6-year-old kid, Renee's child, because that child is going to grow up, and that child is going to be exposed in this day and age of technology to how his mom died and how people reacted to it. And that child is going to see that the vice president of the country that he was raised in at the moment of that tragedy basically said that his mom deserved to die. And I hope that fuels that young man to do good in his community and to stand up to people like J.D. Vance and forever oppose him. People talk about radicalization and what motivates people to take certain positions. Violence radicalizes people. Justification of violence radicalizes people. One of the reasons why Dr. King took the strategy of a Gandhi and shaped it in a way that African Americans, especially those of the Christian faith, could embrace, because he understood that violence against violence was not the answer. When you listen to people like Malcolm X and Huey Newton, they weren't advocating the violence. All they were doing was saying we have a right to defend ourselves against the violence. But to actively campaign against a violent society where people like Bull Connor and others of his ilk were going after people just so they could vote, just so they could sit wherever they wanted on a bus, just so they would have the decency to be able to go to shop through the front door instead of the back or in the basement. where they could sit at a lunch counter to eat without being harassed or ignored. To be able to live their lives with the decency and dignity that every human being, and especially every American citizen, should be afforded. A movement based on nonviolence was the strategy. And I can say that it was successful to the point where opportunities for people like me and others were given for us to be involved in the political process, much to the dismay and the chagrin of people like J.D. Vance, like Steve Bannon, like the Miller family, and others of that ilk. These people are just descendants of Bull Connor. Genetically, maybe, but definitely philosophically. That it just bothers them that somebody that doesn't look like them, that's not a part of their culture, could have the same opportunities, could have the same drive and the same level of success that they think that they're entitled to, that they think that they inherited. And Renee Good was the antithesis of that. This was a young woman, if it was true that she had compassion for those people who are immigrating into our nation and was opposed to her city becoming a police state. In those people's minds, her life was expendable. Well, Mr. Vice President, I'm here to tell you that her life was not expendable. She did not deserve to die. She did not deserve to die in that brutal of a fashion. And I am glad that people of all races, of all nationalities, ethnic groups, the citizens of Minneapolis are saying enough is enough. And yeah, the mayor let his heart out and basically told you where you could go and how you could get there, and said that your presence is not welcome in his city. And he was already feeling some kind of way because of how you trying to disparage a member of Congress from his city, as well as the community she comes from, the Somali community in Minneapolis. And again, it's all a place of racism, systemic and just raw racism. And, you know, in one sense, I should be incensed and just totally out of character. But, you know, one thing is that when you step on someone's toe, they're going to say, ouch. And that old colloquialism means that those who are guilty will confess. And so it is a good moment in one sense that people like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump and Kristi Noem and Steve Bannon and the Miller family are exposing themselves even more to a broader public so that we know who the true enemy is, and that we do everything to make sure that they do not have political power ever again. Just talking to Mr. Hornado, you know, I'm reminded that Indiana at one point was a stronghold for the Ku Klux Klan. They literally controlled every major political office in the state of Indiana. But eventually, the corruption was exposed, their true nature was exposed, and even those people who empathize with that sentiment of racism and discrimination realized that they did not want to associate with the character or lack thereof of members of the Klan. And that basically was the end of their political power as an organization in the United States. And just as quickly as they attained it, it was taken away. And so this year, on November 3rd, 2026, we can do the same thing. We can get rid of this, not forever, and not totally eradicate it, because there are too many people infected with this disease of racism. But we can take away their political power. We can limit their political discourse, because they'll always have the right as Americans to say whatever stupid shit they want to say. Right? That's the give and take of the First Amendment. But it doesn't mean that they need to be in positions of leadership ever again. You can stand on any street corner you want to. You can have your little clubs, wherever the case may be. But as far as representing us on a local, state, county, or national or international stage, we cannot afford for another 250 years to have anybody of that ilk in leadership positions again. Too many people have died. Too many people have suffered. Too many people have been uncomfortable because of that mindset, because of that type of leadership. And it is time for that to end. I cannot stress enough how pissed off I am to hear that kind of rhetoric coming from the national leadership of this nation. It was one thing to grow up Black in America, and my parents, my grandparents had to deal with this sort of stuff. And a lot of people thought that once Woodrow Wilson stroked out, that would be the end of that presence in the White House. But, some folks were more artful and crafty in how they articulated those viewpoints. But it wasn't totally eliminated from leadership. But now, this is, as General Travis would say, this is where we draw the line. And, we thought in the summer of 2020, people got the message. And in the subsequent elections, Donald Trump and his ilk were voted out for the most part. But just like a hydra, you can't just cut off one head. You got to cut them all off. And November 3rd, 2026 is our moment. It's very easy for people to say, well, we need to take up arms and we need to do this and do that. No, we need to do what people are doing all over the country now in protesting. The No Kings rallies were a solid foundation in that. And as the elections that have ensued since then have shown, is that we can take them out with the most powerful tool we have as citizens of this nation. And that's the power of the vote. So if you really want to honor the legacy of a George Floyd or Renee Good or a Philando Castile or Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, all of these young men and women who have died at the hands of police violence, Fred Hampton, Mark Clark, just all of these people. You heard me talk about Viola Liuzzo, when I was talking to Dr. Goddard. She was just taking people home from the Selma to Montgomery march when she got murdered. There was another preacher the day before that had come down for the march and was murdered. We're not trying to all be Joan of Arc. We're not trying to be martyrs. And so, unfortunately, when you're dealing with evil, those things happen. But if you want to defeat this, then you've got to vote them out. I don't care what promises they make. I don't care what late night confessions they try to offer. Their true nature has been exposed. If miraculously gas prices and food prices and everything went down 10 to 20%, it's not enough, because it's more than just that. It's one thing to live in a society where we can afford to live in it, but it's not just about money. It's about peace of mind. And as long as these people have any say-so in our day-to-day lives, we'll never have true affordability. We'll never be able to truly live abundantly because things can be cheap, but things will still be oppressive. And I spent 34 years in a state that is a model of that. Yeah, it's not expensive to live in Mississippi, but oppression is still there. And they might cloak it in whatever kind of smooth Christian national rhetoric they'll put out there. Oh, well, we're just doing God's will and all that kind of stuff. No, it's not God's will to be racist. It's not God's will for us to be violent. It's not God's will for us to be greedy. It's time out for that. I mean, just think about it, y'all. A woman whose last name was Good was murdered. That should be enough. Should have been enough for after Alton Sterling and Medgar Evers and Dr. King and all the others. But it's got to be now. We don't have the luxury of being apathetic and not caring about politics anymore. You just heard Indianapolis went from one of the most active political cities in the state to one of the most apathetic. The nation as a whole has just been gradually getting re-energized. But now, this is our moment. And just as bold as J.D. Vance got up there on that podium, we need to be just as bold showing up on Election Day. You want to stand 10 toes down with murder, and we're going to stand 10 toes down in removing power from people like you and your supporters. I don't care how much money they spend to try to convince you otherwise. What you see on your television, what you are hearing from the witnesses need to be your guide. Enough is enough. And I will continue to do my part on this podcast to encourage you to do this and to continue to bring people to the forefront that are fighting these battles every day. I may even get some people from the other side to come on. They've been invited. They show up, we'll give them a mic, but they're going to have to be accountable, right? And I want you all to hold those people in account as well. It's time. It's time. And, Lord willing, we'll address this some more next episode. But until then, y'all, we got to keep fighting. You just got to keep fighting. And November 3rd should be circled on your calendar. All right, that's all I got. Until next time.
NBG Podcast Network.